Some memories don't drift into the background as years pass. They don't soften at the edges or slip quietly into the quieter rooms of the mind. They stay vivid, persistent, lodged deep within a person like a thorn that time cannot pull free. For Private First Class Daniel Rourke, one memory in particular remained sharper than the rest, stubbornly refusing to fade no matter how many decades passed between the moment it happened and the moment he found himself remembering it again. That memory began with a feeling, an ancient instinct older than training, older than fear, older even than war. The feeling of being watched. It was August of 1968, and the air was thick with monsoon humidity, the kind that wrapped itself around you like a wet shroud. Clouds hung low over the canopy, swollen and threatening rain, but unwilling to release it. The jungle smelled of damp earth, rotting leaves, and the faint sweetness of distant flowering trees. Daniel and his squad trudged forward along a narrow footpath worn into the soil by generations of bare feet, livestock, and quiet, resilient villagers. Tall trees stretched upward like pillars holding up the sky. Heavy vines twisted between their trunks, swaying slightly as if the entire forest breathed as one living organism. Every sound, every brush of leaves, every distant bird cry, every snap of a twig seemed magnified. Daniel had only been in Vietnam for a few months, but already the jungle had marked him. It had absorbed him, pressed itself into his senses. He learned quickly that beauty and danger live side by side here, often concealed beneath the same blanket of green. The jungle could shade you, shelter you, even lull you into forgetting where you were. And then, without warning, it could turn hostile, swallowing men whole. He walked point that afternoon, as he often did, scanning the path ahead with eyes sharpened by weeks of patrols. His senses stretched outward like invisible feelers, searching for anything that didn't belong. A broken twig, footprints too fresh, a branch bent at the wrong angle. The smallest detail could spell survival, but today the forest seemed normal. Nothing appeared out of place. No unusual tracks interrupted the soil. No wisps of smoke curled through the leaves. No quiet murmurs of movement drifted on the wind. Even the birds continued their rhythmic calls, their patterns familiar enough that Daniel almost found them comforting. Still, something gnawed at him, something subtle, an offbeat rhythm in the midst of the forest's usual symphony. A feeling he couldn't name. His breathing slowed, his grip tightened on his rifle, his steps softened instinctively. Then movement, so small, so slight, he almost dismissed it as a trick of shifting sunlight. But instinct grabbed his attention and held it there. Behind a cluster of thin bamboo stalks, swaying gently like fingers brushing the air, stood a boy. Thin, barefoot, no older than 8 or 9. His clothes hung loosely over his frame, faded and threadbare from years of wear. His hair fell over his forehead, partially shadowing his eyes. But Daniel saw those eyes clearly. Wide, alert, afraid, but not only afraid. There was something else in them, something deliberate, urgent, calculated. Most children fled at the sight of armed American soldiers. Fear drove them. Survival demanded it. But this boy didn't run. He remained rooted to the spot, as still as the bamboo surrounding him, his breath barely visible from the distance. Daniel's heart pounded once, hard. The boy raised one finger slowly to his lips. A silent command, a plea. Daniel's entire body went still. Then, with a trembling but decisive motion, the boy pointed, not toward Daniel or the soldiers behind him, but toward the ridge ahead, a narrow passage between 2 tall rocks where the path tightened into a natural funnel. The boy didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The message was clear, carried in the stark fear in his eyes. Danger ahead. Don't go forward. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink, until nothing existed except Daniel and the boy. The sounds of the jungle, distant insects, rustling leaves, the careful footsteps of the men behind him all faded into a muted hum. Even the air felt still, thick with warning. In that fragile, suspended moment, Daniel didn't see an enemy's child. He didn't see a stranger. He didn't see a threat or a spy. He saw a human being, a terrified, brave child, risking something Daniel couldn't yet comprehend, trying to save the life of someone he had no reason to save. Daniel gave a slight nod, a movement so small only someone staring directly at him would notice. The boy's expression shifted, just barely, as if relief washed through him. Then, without a sound, he stepped backward. A single step, then another, and the bamboo swallowed him like a ghost dissolving into the forest. One blink, and he was gone. Daniel stood there, heart thundering, breath shallow, staring at the empty space where the boy had been. He didn't know the child's name, didn't know where he came from, didn't know what danger lay ahead. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever waited beyond that ridge was real, and it was deadly. Daniel would remember that face, that warning, that moment, not for a year, not for a decade, but for the rest of his life. Daniel didn't hesitate. The boy's warning echoed silently through him, a cold hand gripping the back of his neck. He lifted one fist, signaling halt, then swept his arm toward the dense brush lining the trail. The squad reacted instantly, though confusion flickered in their eyes. They trusted his instincts, even when he couldn't yet explain them. Boots slipped off the narrow footpath and sank into damp soil. Rifles lowered toward the undergrowth, shoulders tucked behind tree trunks slick with moss. In seconds, 12 men disappeared into the green. They pressed themselves low, crawling behind a curtain of ferns and twisted vines. The earth was wet and soft beneath them, breathing out the humid scent of rot and living roots. Mosquitoes buzzed in tight, hungry spirals around their necks and ears. Sweat pooled at the base of their spines. No one dared swat. No one dared move. The jungle, moments earlier alive with distant birds and rustling leaves, seemed to stretch itself thin with anticipation. Every sound grew sharper, every silence grew louder. Daniel flattened himself behind a thick patch of brush, his fingers wrapped around the grip of his rifle, the metal warm beneath his palm. He forced each breath to come slowly, deliberately, steadying the rising swell of adrenaline in his veins. He kept his gaze fixed on the bend in the trail, the place where the boy had pointed. A place that just minutes ago he had been walking toward without a second thought. Minutes trickled by with the patience of dripping water. Sweat rolled into Daniel's eyes, stinging, but he didn't blink. His entire body felt locked in place, as if the jungle itself had pressed a hand to his back and whispered, "Wait." Then, barely audible but unmistakable, a sound broke through the humming forest. A soft, rhythmic crunch, the cadence of boots against dirt, not hurried, not careless, the tread of someone who knew this land well. Daniel's pulse spiked. He tightened his grip. Figures emerged, barely visible through layers of leaves and bamboo. 5 of them. Men in faded uniforms, their faces sharp with experience, the muzzles of their rifles pointed toward the ground but ready to lift at the slightest command. Their movements were smooth, confident. They didn't need to scout the area. They already knew what they were walking into. Daniel watched as one of the soldiers approached the stone choke point ahead, running his hand along the rock's edge as if confirming a familiar landmark. Another crouched, scanning the greenery for signs of movement. 2 more took positions behind the stones, settling in with practiced precision. And then Daniel saw it. The way their eyes lingered on the trail. The way they kept glancing back toward the bend. The way one of them lifted his rifle just slightly, anticipating shapes that would appear in single file. They weren't passing through, they were waiting. His throat tightened. That boy, small, silent, barefoot, had led them away from a slaughter. Daniel imagined the first burst of gunfire tearing through him, the follow-up round shredding the men behind him before they even registered what was happening. He imagined their bodies falling into the dust, another nameless tragedy swallowed by a war full of them. A soldier beside Daniel shifted quietly, his breath hitching as realization washed over him. A shared understanding passed between them like static. They had been seconds away from dying. The enemy lingered in their ambush positions, whispering among themselves, growing tense as the minutes dragged on and no American soldiers appeared. One of them rose with a frustrated grunt and spat into the dirt. He issued a terse command. The others obeyed without argument. Then, as silently as they'd come, they dissolved back into the forest. Their silhouettes disappeared behind a wall of green until the only proof they had existed at all was the faint sway of branches returning to stillness. Daniel remained motionless until the jungle resumed its normal pulse. The insects humming, the bamboo creaking with the wind, the distant birds calling to one another as if the danger had never pressed its knife edge against the moment. Finally, he exhaled, a long, shaking breath that seemed to drain months of tension from his bones. The men emerged slowly from the brush, their faces pale and stunned. Nobody needed to say a word. They all knew what had almost happened. They all knew who had stopped it. When Daniel stepped back onto the trail, he looked toward the place where the boy had stood. The bamboo swayed softly, as if stirred by something unseen. No footprints, no broken stems, no hint of where he had gone. Just the lingering presence of a child who had appeared at the precise moment between fate and doom, then vanished before gratitude could ever find him. And as Daniel walked on, one thought burned into him with absolute certainty. They were alive because of him. The war swept Daniel across Vietnam like a leaf carried by a restless river, never stopping long enough for him to anchor himself, never gentle enough for reflection. His unit moved from dense jungles to open paddies, from quiet villages to tense outposts where the air itself felt wired with danger. Days bled into one another, marked only by orders, exhaustion, and the sound of distant gunfire that rolled across the landscape like a second heartbeat. Yet despite the chaos, despite the blur of survival and routine, one memory refused to dissolve into the noise of war. The boy in the bamboo. Daniel tried to focus on the tasks that demanded his attention, scanning the horizon, checking for tripwires, listening for the subtle shift of wind that sometimes carried warning signs. But the image of that child, barefoot, frightened, unbelievably brave, kept drifting into his thoughts when he least expected it. Sometimes, when passing through a village, he found himself observing every child who darted between the homes, wondering if one of them carried eyes that knew something unspoken, something urgent. He searched for faces that seemed too aware, too guarded, too old for their age. He never saw the boy again, and that absence weighed more than the memory itself. At night, lying on a thin cot with the canvas above him rippling from the jungle breeze, Daniel's mind often returned to that single moment of warning. He would picture the boy's trembling finger pressed to his lips, the cautious step backward into the bamboo, the way he seemed to vanish as if swallowed by the land. The longer Daniel thought about it, the more a quiet dread grew within him. He wondered if the boy had been watched, if someone had noticed his gesture, if someone had recognized what he'd done. War rarely forgave kindness. That truth haunted Daniel more than any firefight ever had. When the war finally ended for him, when he boarded the aircraft that lifted him out of the thick humidity and into cloud and sky, he looked down and promised himself he would not forget. But promises made in the midst of conflict often fade once the world becomes ordinary again. Except this one didn't. Among the few items he brought home was a small wooden carving he had found near the bamboo hours after the ambush, a rough, uneven bird with wings that looked too large for its tiny body. It was the kind of carving that spoke of patience and simple hands, of evenings spent whittling scraps of wood into something meaningful. Daniel didn't know if the boy had made it or if it had belonged to him, but he felt drawn to it instantly, as if it held some imprint of the moment that had saved his life. He kept it in the nightstand beside his bed. Over the years, it became both a keepsake and a question. Some months he forgot it was there, tucked beneath old letters and spare coins. Other times, especially on sleepless nights when rain tapped softly against the window, he found himself holding it again, the wood smooth beneath his thumb, wondering about the path that child's life had taken. Life moved forward in the steady way life always does. Daniel married the woman who brought him laughter again. He became a father to 2 children who grew with the same unpredictable, vibrant energy that life always grants the young. He worked long hours, coached soccer games, attended school concerts, celebrated birthdays, endured losses, and watched his children become adults. His decades were filled with the ordinary beauty of everyday living. But the carving remained, a quiet sentinel of gratitude, a fragment of a moment that had altered the course of not just one life, but many. His children existed because he had survived. Their children existed because he had been warned. A ripple of futures had sprung from a single silent gesture in the jungle. When Daniel turned 70, he found himself staring at the carving once more. His hands were different now, lined, trembling, mapped with years of work and time. His eyes burned with a sudden rush of emotion he hadn't felt in years. The carving felt impossibly small in his grip, yet unbearably heavy with meaning. He realized, in a way he couldn't ignore anymore, that his life would feel unfinished if he didn't at least try to find the boy. Now a man, if he still lived. The odds were slim, perhaps hopeless. Vietnam had changed. The land had changed. People had scattered, rebuilt, forgotten, moved on. But Daniel hadn't forgotten. And he couldn't. Some debts don't fade. Some gratitude stretches across generations, carried like a quiet current beneath the surface of a life. And so, with age at his shoulders but clarity in his heart, Daniel made a decision he had avoided for decades. It was time to go back. Flying into Vietnam 50 years later felt like traveling into a dream where the past and present overlapped in unsettling yet beautiful ways. High-rise buildings pierced the skyline where burnt fields once lay. Motorbikes swarmed like schools of fish through streets now alive with vendors, neon signs, and modern storefronts. It was loud, vibrant, thriving. But Daniel wasn't here for the cities. He was here for the quiet places. The places where memories lived, the places where a child had once stood barefoot among bamboo and changed the direction of another man's life. With the help of Min, a local guide who listened with respect and curiosity, Daniel retraced the path he had walked as a soldier. Every turn of the road, every cluster of trees, every rice paddy carried echoes of another time. The air smelled different now, cleaner, lighter. The land felt healed, even if its scars were hidden beneath layers of growth and new beginnings. Families worked fields in peace, dogs dozed in the heat, and water buffalo grazed lazily along the roadside. But sometimes, just for a second, Daniel felt like he was 20 again. Like he could hear the distant rotors of helicopters behind the clouds. Like he could smell the sharp tang of gunpowder lingering on wind. Like the past was stepping on the heels of the present, trying to catch up. Min led him to a rural village surrounded by rice fields that shimmered in the sun. Wooden houses stood on stilts, and children ran barefoot along the dirt paths, laughing, the same way the boy of Daniel's memory had once run. Though that boy had run for different reasons. When Daniel shared his story, villagers listened with quiet reverence. Some nodded knowingly, as if recalling their own memories of war. Others whispered among themselves, searching their minds for the face of a child who warned an American soldier in 1968. An elderly woman stepped forward. Her eyes were gentle but sharp with memory. "I knew a boy like that," she said softly. "He was brave. Too brave for his age." Daniel felt his breath catch. The woman motioned for him to follow. The woman led Daniel down a narrow dirt path that wound between groves of jackfruit and tamarind trees. Their broad leaves rustled softly in the breeze, filtering sunlight into shifting patterns across the ground. Each footstep felt like it carried him further into a memory he had held for half a century. The closer he came to the house, the more the world seemed to quiet, as if the land itself recognized the weight of what was about to unfold. The small wooden home stood shaded beneath the wide canopy of the trees, its stilts worn smooth by time and weather. Though humble, it was clearly cared for. Its porch swept clean, the bamboo slats neatly mended, and a simple hand-carved ornament hanging above the doorway. It swayed gently in the wind, tapping a soft, rhythmic beat like an old heartbeat. The woman motioned toward the doorway with a respectful nod. "This is his home," she murmured. Daniel's breath trembled as he stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and river water. On the far side of the room, a man in his late 50s sat on a low wooden stool, repairing the handle of a fishing net. His posture was relaxed, but his movements were deliberate, slow, practiced, seasoned by decades of repetition. His hands, weathered from sun and labor, handled the net with gentle precision. When he lifted his head to see who had entered, Daniel felt something inside him shift. There, in the man's eyes, behind the lines of age and the calm of a simple life, lived a familiar seriousness, a stillness that struck him like a forgotten echo. It wasn't that the man looked the same as the child from the bamboo grove, that time had reshaped him, but something in his gaze, in the cautious way he assessed Daniel, carried the unmistakable imprint of a boy who once stood silently among swaying stalks, urging a stranger to live. Min began speaking, explaining the story with quiet respect. The man listened without interruption. His face didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. Recognition, or perhaps the return of a memory he had carefully, deliberately buried. He didn't blink, didn't shift. His hands stilled on the net, resting in his lap as if frozen in a moment he had spent decades trying to forget. When Min finished translating, the room felt suspended in time. The man inhaled slowly, his chest rising with the weight of 50 years. "Yes," he said at last, his voice low, steady, yet fragile at the edges. "I remember." The final word cracked ever so slightly, like a thin shell splitting down the middle. He stood, joints stiff from years of work, and stepped closer to Daniel. He scanned the older man's face with the quiet focus of someone assembling pieces of a long-lost puzzle. His eyes traced the subtle scar near Daniel's temple, the shape of his jaw, the lines time had carved into his skin. "You were very young," the man murmured. "You looked afraid, like all of you did." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I was," he whispered. "We all were." The man nodded once, slowly. His voice softened, his eyes turning distant. "I warned you because I did not want to watch more people die. I was a child, but I understood fear. I understood loss, even then." Silence draped itself over the room, heavy and tender. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his bag. He pulled out a small cloth bundle and unfolded it with care. Inside lay the wooden carving, worn smooth by time but still carrying the unmistakable shape of the bird's wings and tail. The moment the man saw it, his breath hitched sharply, as if the air had been snatched from his lungs. "My father made this," he whispered, stepping forward with trembling fingers. "I dropped it when I ran. I thought it was gone forever." Daniel offered the carving without a word. Their hands touched only briefly, but in that instant something powerful and wordless passed between them. 50 years of unspoken history, grief, gratitude, and the strange bond of two lives intersecting at the edge of death and mercy. Hugh, because that was the boy's name, Daniel finally learned, closed his fingers slowly around the carving. He held it to his chest with both hands, as if returning a piece of himself he never expected to see again. His eyes glistened with tears he fought hard to contain. "For many years," Hugh said softly, "I wondered if the soldier I warned survived. I wondered if it mattered. I wondered if you remembered." Daniel felt his own eyes burning, emotion rising like a tide he could no longer hold back. "I remembered," he said, voice breaking. "Every day, every year. I remembered your face, your courage. You saved my life. You saved the men behind me. You gave me a future I didn't deserve, but one I'm grateful for every single day." For a long moment, neither man spoke. They simply looked at one another. Two men shaped by the same moment, standing on opposite sides of time, but finally meeting on the same ground. A smile slowly formed on Hugh's face. It was small, fragile, but warm, carrying traces of joy and sorrow, pride and relief, the complexities of a life lived beneath the shadow of war. "And thank you," Hugh said quietly, "for remembering, for coming back, for proving that what I did meant something." Daniel nodded, unable to speak, because in that moment he knew it had meant everything. They sat beneath the jackfruit tree long after the sun began its slow descent across the fields. The air grew cooler, shadows stretching into long ribbons across the ground. The village settled into its evening rhythm, cook fires lighting, roosters quieting, children chasing the last minutes of daylight. Daniel and Hugh spoke about the war, about the families they built afterward, about the long road from fear to peace. Sometimes they spoke in words through Min. Other times silence did the speaking for them. Silence filled with understanding, with gratitude, with years of weight lifting softly between them. Hugh told Daniel how his family hid in the jungle, moving constantly, how he lost friends, how he learned to listen for danger the same way a trapped animal learns to sense a snare. How that day, when he saw American soldiers walking toward the ridge, he knew what would happen if he didn't act. "I didn't think I was brave," Hugh said. "I was just tired of death." Daniel nodded, blinking back tears. "I lived because of you," he said. "I had a daughter. I have grandchildren now, because you pointed toward danger instead of turning away." Hugh looked at him with something like quiet pride. "You listened," he replied. "Many would not have." As twilight settled over the village, Daniel rose slowly. His knees protested, but his heart felt light in a way it hadn't in decades. He and Hugh stood facing each other, the former soldier and the child he once was, bound together not by war but by the moment they chose humanity over fear. Hugh reached out and took Daniel's hand. "Go home," he said gently. "Live the rest of your life in peace. We both survived. Let that be enough." Daniel's voice broke as he answered, "It is." And as he walked away, the wooden carving now returned to its rightful owner, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt since he was young. A sense of closure, a sense of release, a sense that the ghosts of the past had finally quieted. Some stories don't end on the battlefield. They end decades later, in a quiet village, beneath a jackfruit tree, when two lives separated by war meet again in peace. And for Daniel, that was the ending he had been searching for across 50 long years.